Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video on Plato's Theaetetus and just the easiest, tiniest bit of Euclid's Elements. Now, I have to say, out of all of the Plato that we've been able to read together, all of the other dialogues that we have discussed together have definitely been like super canonical dialogues, like dialogues that you need to know, you absolutely need to know when other philosophy people want to talk to you about Plato. Now, the dialogue that we're doing for this week, the Theaetetus, it is extremely important, but I would say that it figures among the more optional, right? This dialogue is maybe more reflective of my own tastes in terms of philosophical inquiry, right? It's less central than, say, the Symposium or the Republic or so on. And this is mostly because the Theaetetus is a later dialogue. So, at this point, it's connected with a series of other dialogues, like the Parmenides and the Statesman, and so on, right? And these are dialogues that we consider to be some of Plato's later works. So they were composed, we think, after the Republic, after, all of the dialogues concerning Socrates' execution. And really, what these later dialogues do is they narrow in even more on the theory of forms, right? They attempt to maybe state the strongest possible challenges to the theory of forms, and attempt to explain how the theory of forms can best these challenges, right? The later dialogues are very unconventional. They don't necessarily reflect the early dialogues. A lot of the time it might be like the Republic, Plato kind of monologuing a lot, right? But sometimes, like in the Theaetetus actually, Plato draws on aspects from his early work, right? Namely, he has Socrates in this sort of like a question-giving role, right? Socrates is a summoner of other people's ideas. He's not, dispensing his own wisdom right now, right? And so the Theaetetus, for that purpose, is really, really fascinating to look back on, right? Because it seems to contain elements of all these different aspects of Plato's philosophy. And it's also what we might call, at least in the Western tradition, the founding document of epistemology, right? So this text, more than any other text before it, really, that we've looked at, interrogates the question of what is knowledge, right? And knowledge has come up, obviously, in a number of the other, Plato dialogues that we've discussed up to this point, right? Justice, for example, is a kind of knowledge. Wisdom is a kind of knowledge, right? And so knowledge has been really central to Plato's account of what the philosopher is and why they're just and why they're virtuous and so on, right? And maybe the closest thing that we've had to a really like epistemological moment in Plato's corpus to this point would be in the Meno, right? Where Meno tried to ask, like, how is new knowledge possible? And we're going to see Meno's paradox come up again in this text. But you can see that that dialogue really asks a kind of how question, right? How is knowledge possible? The Theaetetus seeks to answer in what is, in a Platonic sense at least, a more basic question, which is a what question, right? Not how do we get knowledge, but what is knowledge, right? And this was exactly the thing that, Socrates in the Meno was chastising Meno for, that he was trying to answer these questions about whether or not virtue is teachable and stuff like that, without answering the prior question of what virtue actually is, right? And so this dialogue is 100% zeroed in on the question of what is knowledge, what constitutes knowledge, when can we rightly be said to have knowledge, and so on. And the dialogue is called the Theaetetus because Socrates is talking to this guy, Theaetetus, right? We've seen this before, the Euthyphro, the the Meno and so on, right? So the guy he's talking to is Theaetetus, right? But Theaetetus is not like Meno or one of these other guys, right? Theaetetus gets actually introduced, by Theodorus as being like this especially virtuous, especially gifted mathematician and geometer, right? And it turns out that Theaetetus was in fact a real person who did exist and was in fact extremely talented at mathematics and geometry. He was actually a member of Plato's academy. And it's going to turn out that it's some of Theaetetus's mathematical thoughts and geometric insights that are going to show up in Euclid. Euclid, was not entirely original, almost no thinker ever is, right? He was summarizing and trying to dispense the accomplishments of Greek mathematical knowledge to that point, right? And so certainly one of the people that Euclid really draws on in the Elements is Theaetetus, right? And so it has this really interesting connection between Platonic philosophy and mathematical tradition that very, very much comes out in this dialogue together. So I'm really excited to get into it with you all. I do want to issue a warning. I mean, you might have already read the dialogue at this point, but it is long, right? It's the longest thing that I'm asking you to read within a week's time. So note that, right? Give yourself the appropriate level of time. Okay. So I've divided up our board here into 4 quadrants. So I want to begin with this first quadrant, midwifery, right? So essentially, I'm not going to describe all the twists and turns in the dialogue because it's quite long and there's a lot of them, but I'll describe at least the major moments to make sure that you feel that you're getting a good grasp of what's going on in the plot, the movement of the dialogue, right? And so Theaetetus begins by seeking to define knowledge through mathematics, geometry, and crafts, right? Techne. Okay, we shouldn't be surprised that this is the first place that someone goes, especially the first place that like a mathematician and a geometer would go, right? They're like, oh, well, mathematics is knowledge, geometry is knowledge. The application of mathematics and geometry when we make stuff like houses is knowledge, right? And you do use a lot of mathematics whenever you make stuff. I mean, if you want a concrete example of this, your house is going to stand up a lot better if you build it at right angles, right? And so Theaetetus already here is exemplifying this idea that crafts, techne, are a manifestation of a kind of mathematical knowledge. Impressive, right? Okay, and then Socrates describes himself as an intellectual midwife, right? So a midwife is someone who helps a woman who is pregnant deliver a baby. So Socrates helps people that he thinks are pregnant with delivering an idea, right? He has very interesting things to say about how his mother was a midwife, and he's taking after his mother by being a kind of midwife, but not with women, but with men's ideas, right? I mean, other than the recounting of Diotima, we don't see Socrates or Plato really discuss or have women speak, right? Very much. And so Socrates wants to say, he is an intellectual midwife in the sense that he's barren, right? Like he doesn't have his own children, he doesn't have his own ideas. And so he sees his central purpose in helping others deliver children, namely ideas, right? And hence this is the sort of gadfly kind of quality to Socrates, right? He constantly questions your account, right? And part of the reason why he wants to do that is because he wants to see if you're delivering a true child or what he calls a wind egg, right? Which would just be like, there's no real baby, or, this would happen because sometimes, birds would mistake rocks for their eggs, right? And obviously nothing's coming from the rock, right? And so, in a way, what Socrates is doing is he's helping people check, okay, do you have a real idea in there somewhere? Or is it just a wind egg? Is it really nothing? Is it, not a viable idea, right? And so here we can see the development of two themes that we've already seen, right? Pregnancy, the symposium described pregnancy in a lot of depth, right? Diotima talked not only about physical pregnancy, but also intellectual pregnancy, right? Wanting to bring an idea out into the world. It described this form of intellectual inquiry as being, of the same kind as the nurturing relationship that parents have towards their children, right? And similarly, we have this idea of summoners in education from the Republic, right? Socrates is someone who, in a way, kind of summons you to utilize your reason, to educate yourself, to direct or orient yourselves towards the forms. And we're going to see that that's exactly the role that he plays in this dialogue, right? And so, obviously Socrates is not happy. Anytime he's given the list answer, he's not happy, right? Well, we don't want three kinds of knowledge: mathematical knowledge, geometric knowledge, and craft knowledge, or something like that. We want to describe how all of these things are manifestations of one thing, namely knowledge, right? And so we don't want it just the various instances of knowledge, but we want the general form of knowledge. Should be very familiar move to you, right, by this point. And so Theaetetus, moving on to the second quadrant, then suggests that knowledge is perception, right? So we say that we know something when I perceive it, right? In front of me, I perceive my computer, I perceive the board, and it's in virtue of these perceptions that I can be said to know it, right? And Plato immediately it links this to Protagoras' view that man is the measure of all things, right? It's important to really break down what it means to say that knowledge is perception, right? And what it means is this, right? When I say you and I are both having a Diet Coke, right? I love Diet Coke. I think Diet Coke is magnificent. I think the flavor is transcendent, all of this kind of stuff, right? Typical stuff for Diet Coke lovers, right? But you maybe think it has this weird aspartame taste. You maybe don't like it so much. Maybe it's, too bubbly or too sweet or too syrupy or something like that, right? And so I perceive it as good and you perceive it as bad, right? Okay? Well, so this view then says, well, my judgment, right, my saying that it's good is true for me, and when you say that it's bad, that's true for you, right? And the idea is, well, things are constantly changing, right? We're constantly changing in our position and perspective and so on, right? And so whether or not I'll enjoy it from one moment to the next, right, is simply a product of whether or not it changes, right? Stuff's changing all the time. That sort of thing could change too, right? And in fact, this does happen, right? We perceive things differently as we grow older. Things that maybe we enjoy when we're a child because of their sweetness and so on become less appealing to us as adults and so on, right? And so knowledge is perception. This is an epistemological view. It's saying, what is required for you to have knowledge of something? Well, it's the very minimal condition that you just perceive it. You just see it some way, right? And then that way that you see it is true for you, right? And so this is how you get a kind of relativistic account of knowledge, right? Hence, man is the measure of all things, right? So is Diet Coke good or bad? Is it wonderful and delicious, or is it disgusting, putrid, vile, right? Well, it depends on the nature of the perceiver, right? This is what this account has to say. And so Plato, is extracting from Theaetetus, right, kind of from Protagoras too, this view, namely that knowledge just is perception, right? And this is an epistemological view. All you need to have knowledge is belief, right? If you believe something, then that counts as knowledge, right? And that's because there's no universal standard or something like that by which we could judge the perspective, right? And then Plato also wants to say, well, underneath this epistemological view about relativism and so on, right, is a metaphysical view that things are constantly in motion, right? We shouldn't be surprised that the Diet Coke is good and then bad and then good and then bad because it's constantly changing, right? And so the epistemological view of relativism coheres really well with this sort of Heraclitean view about nature constantly being in flux, right? And so Plato identifies this view that knowledge is perception as being present in Homer, right? It's in poetry, right? It's how Homer describes the world. It's in Heraclitus expressed philosophically. And it's in Protagoras, and maybe the most worked out epistemological view, right? And so this first account is basically sophistic, right? Why is it sophistic? Well, because you don't care about the truth, right? It's just like one person gives an account that's true for them, another person gives an account that's true for them, and so on, right? There's no like truth simpliciter. There's no truth finally speaking, not just true for you or true for me, but true in general, true for everyone, right? And so you can see how these epistemological views and metaphysical views are related, right? And this group of people, even though they seem to have wildly different beliefs, maybe, all belong to basically the same family, right? Namely, people that have an incredibly minimal criterion for what counts as knowledge, right? And so let's move on to some of the last accounts that we give, the more developed accounts that Theaetetus gives towards the end of the dialogue, right? The problem with the sophistic view is that it contradicts itself, right? Okay, just think about this. These are examples that Plato brings up, right? So accept the sophistic view. All you need for knowledge is perception, right? I say, I really like cake. Okay, right? Fine, that counts as knowledge. But then you could say, Penny doesn't really like cake. Right? And then that would have to be true for you, right? So the point is, we not only make judgments about the contents of our own perceptions, but also we make judgments about the contents of other people's perceptions, right? So like when you and me had the disagreement about whether or not we thought Diet Coke was really yummy or not, right? It's not only that we had these judgments about Diet Coke, but then we have these second order judgments, right? Second order beliefs where you're like, wow, Penny's crazy, right? For liking this, right? You not only think, that I'm wrong about Diet Coke, right? But then you have the additional belief, yeah, her statement was false. She was wrong in this case, right? And so it seems like we need to attribute knowledge to me from my own perspective, but also deny it to me when someone is critical of my perspective, right? Or what if I get into a further dispute with you and I'm like, no, I'm right? Does that just mean that we have to accept my own description of my own psychical events, right? That seems really weird. If I say something is red and you say something is green, then it's built in to you saying that it's green that I am wrong for saying that it's red, right? And so it's not like all of our beliefs are like little islands unto themselves, right? Where they're perfectly self-consistent because they're all individual and like you only look at your own beliefs and you don't look at other people's beliefs or whatever. But to the contrary, beliefs, truths, knowledge is interconnected with each other, right? It's not that we're all islands onto our own, right? Things are true for us because they're true in general, right? And so we have to move away from a relativistic account that would say that the truth, comes from me or it comes from my perspective, to saying we need some way of judging whether or not my perspective is even right. And that can't just come from me, and it can't just come from some other person, but we have to think about the questions of right or wrong in general, right? And this move towards the simple cases is just the move towards the forms, right? So the initial account contradicts itself, right? The same people are held to be knowledgeable by themselves and held not to be knowledgeable by others, and there's no way of assessing these competing claims, right, within that framework. And so, I think that, this has very practical resonance for us when we can't say who has knowledge. I mean, just think about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? It was an urgent issue to know who knows what about what, and who's bullshitting and who's trying to scam you, right? And to just be like, oh well, I think that drinking bleach is gonna cure your COVID, man, right? Like, you having that perception is not sufficient for knowledge, right? It doesn't work that way. And hence, like, there are very practical stakes for this stuff, right? The fact that the sophistic account contradicts itself, right? That's not only like Plato's a big nerd and so he cares about consistency or something like that, but it's also an eminently practical problem, right? You've given an account of knowledge that fails to be able to even distinguish between people who have knowledge and people who don't, right? So that is the core of Plato's criticism of the sophistic account, right? On the one hand, you have the pretense towards having knowledge, right? But also you could never have any form of real truth or justification, right? Because you relativize everything. So Theaetetus tries to amend the account to add the part that we need, and instead says knowledge is true judgment, right? This is where he starts, right? So the first problem with the sophistic account is it didn't have an account of truth, right? The sophists tried to make everything true by saying that it was all just what we believed to be true, right? But we not only disagree amongst each other, we also disagree internally sometimes, right? Like, at one moment I think it's true that Diet Coke is yummy, and then maybe I get a stomachache or something like that, and I try it again, and I'm like, no, this is disgusting, right? It's making me nauseous or whatever. And so what we need, right, is the dimension of the truth, right? That's what we needed in the COVID stuff, right? It's not just that you know stuff because you feel some way about COVID or you feel some way about 5G or whatever, right? You need to also have the truth on your side, right? And then there has to be another amendment, which is that you not only need the truth, but you need an account, a logos. You need some sort of justification for why you think you're true, right? Or why what you think is true, right? And so the Theaetetus is regularly identified as the real source for this really, really common view in Western philosophy that knowledge is justified, true belief, right? Belief is like perception, right? That's just believing something is the case, right? Truth is this true judgment stuff, right? And to have an account or a logos is to have a justification, right? And so here, we've arrived at the most sophisticated account of knowledge that Theaetetus is able to give in the dialogue. But things do not end there, right? Let's actually move to this last quadrant. So, Theaetus, what? No, my marker ran out. No. Theaetetus. Okay. Sorry about that. I just should have ignored it. Anyway, one paradox of Theaetetus is what counts as an account, right? Actually, surprisingly enough, Plato ends the Theaetetus, Socrates ends the Theaetetus dissatisfied with the answer that they've given, right? He's not actually happy with knowledge as justified true belief. Why? Because he doesn't think that we've really given a sophisticated enough account of what knowledge is, what justification is, which is to give a logos, right? Theaetetus's best example of what it means to give an account of something is Theaetetus says we have an account of SO and we have an account of S and an account of O. That might sound really basic, right? But the idea here is really profound, which is that to get knowledge of a complex thing, in this case SO, right, just means breaking that complex thing down to its simplest components, its elements, right? And so SO, to give an account of SO, is to give an account of S and to give an account of O, right? But the reason why Socrates isn't satisfied is, well, how do we get knowledge of the simples, right? This is a procedure, call it analysis. Analysis means like cutting apart, right? So you're getting one part and then you're getting the other part, right? Analysis lets us move from complex to simple. But there's no corresponding thing to do when things are simple, right? I can't do this example with S, right? There's no two parts of S that I can break it up into. And so Socrates starts to think, well, it's not good enough for us to just assume that the elements are right because they're what our whole system of knowledge is based on. But it's also not clear at all how we can have knowledge of them, namely how we can ever have a justification for the most basic items of our knowledge, right? If justification just consists in giving an analysis, right? How do we get knowledge of the simples? And my suggestion for this week is that we can read Euclid's Elements as an answer to this question, right? Surely Euclid, was probably not really thinking of Plato or whatever. Maybe he was. I mean, he was thinking about all these mathematicians that were associated with the academy, whatever, right? But Euclid seeks to revolutionize our system of mathematics by giving us the simplest components of mathematical truths, which he calls axioms, right? And hence, the reading that we did together for the Euclid, right? This is really, really fascinating, really interesting stuff. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but if you went an hour north to St. John's, right, then if you were studying mathematics, you were a math major, then they have you start with Euclid's Elements, right? I mean, that just speaks to how powerful this book is, that 2,000 years later, people still read it, people still think about this as the mathematics textbook in history. This is the one, and innumerable philosophers took Euclid to be the paradigm instance of knowledge, right? If there's any knowledge in the whole world, many philosophers are convinced, then it is the knowledge that we get in Euclid's Elements, right? And even though sometimes we talk about non-Euclidean geometries, right, for the vast majority of the geometry that we're interested in doing, Euclid's system still works. And so in that way, it's really, fantastic and amazing. And what I've given you is really just the beginning, right? I've given you the definitions which begin the book, right? And, the most famous segment of the book is really the opening, where Euclid attempts to define a point, a line, a plane, and so on, right? A point is that which has no part, right? It is an element. It is a simple, right? It is exactly what we were talking about when we were talking about S and O, right? So Euclid's Elements begins with the most primitive mathematical idea, right? Which in this case is a point, right? A point is not definable in terms of lines, right? But lines are, in a way, definable in terms of a sequence of points, right? Um, the extremities of a line are points. This is the third definition, right? And so Euclid's idea, the way that he tackles this problem that Socrates points out for our knowledge of the elements of things, is he tries to give an account of the elements where we have basic definitions and axioms that are meant to be totally transparent, right? Like there's no way it could get any more basic, and there's no way that you could ever conceivably misunderstand, right? Hence, the definitions are for the basic necessities for doing geometry, right? A point, a line, a straight line, a surface, right? An angle, and so on. These are the basic concepts that figure in any polygon whatsoever, right? We might notice too that Euclid's account of what the elements are precisely things that we don't perceive, right? I don't perceive points anywhere, right? I can maybe draw a point or draw a line in my head, right? But these common notions are not immediately present in stuff, right? They're ideas that I have. They're the forms of things that apply to all the particular cases. And so I hope you can see a basic continuity, even if we didn't really get into any of the mathematical stuff or anything like that of the Euclid, how it attempts to respond to this problem about knowledge proposed in the Theaetetus, which is that for any justification, we need a further justification, and then a further justification, and then a further justification, and so on and so forth, and to the point where we have no knowledge, right? We have no account that we can give. How does Euclid attempt to answer this problem? Well, he attempts to answer the problem by saying that the elements, the basic parts, right, of our geometrical knowledge are simple and known, right? That in a certain kind of way, they explain themselves, right? There's no need to break it down any further. This is as simple as it gets. And just by knowing what the idea is, right, I understand it. In a way, the way that an early modern philosopher might describe it, right, is that if I just know or even have an idea of what a point is, then I must know that Euclid's definition of it is true, right? I wonder how much and to what extent this all resonates with you. Do you find Euclid's system really satisfying as a response to the epistemological problem of the Theaetetus? If not, what kind of approach do you think works, right? When do we have justified true knowledge? When are we done with giving an account or a logos? I'm very interested in hearing what you all have to say. This is the end of our Plato adventure together, at least for now. And I've had a really, really great time. I'm very excited to get into the Aristotle starting next week. Bye-bye.